The Studio Display is Apple's latest monitor. Aluminum sharp edges, precise carved ventilation, and a vibrant screen that's brighter than anything else on the market at that price point. Guys, I can't believe the controversy that this thing has caused. Of course, anything coming in at that price point of $2,000 Canadian or $16.99 US is subject to some questioning of, is it worth it? Now, I want to note that I typically buy products that I want to invest in and that I plan to keep, but this one was one of the very few products where I contemplated potentially returning this thing, with the understanding that there's a lot of other things that you can do with $2,000 Canadian. But a lot of contemplation went into that decision, and of course your question is it worth the price, and is it right for you? Two very important questions, and we'll get to both of those along with some real-world tests, but let's start out with the basics, what this monitor packs into it. There's a lot you can say about this particular monitor, but if you said it wasn't an extremely premium monitor, you'd be wrong. In typical Apple fashion, they made something special that looks great both at a distance and up close. Now, some of you watching are going to be like, okay, so what? It's a screen. But let me remind you that in this world that we're living in, it's such a highly saturated market with cheap plastic monitors that feel uninspired in their design and their build quality. And sure, they work, but they certainly don't feel premium. And then there's the finish of the monitor screen, which is usually matte, whereas Apple is one of the few monitors that are still coming with a glossy finish, which I much prefer. Featuring a 27-inch screen, 5K Retina display, reaching a max brightness of 600 nits, black bezels, and on that bezel, they've packed in a 12-megapixel ultra-wide camera with center stage so it can follow you around within the frame as you move. Again, while other monitors are made of copious amounts of plastic, the Studio Display comes with an aluminum finish, starting with the base, which again highly resembles that 24-inch iMac and wraps around the sides and the back of the display. It really does seem like they took this heavy inspiration from that 24-inch iMac and then brought the return of the black bezels to make something that feels familiar and unapologetically Apple. Now, the differences from that iMac is the noticeable thickness of this monitor. Still not large by any means, of course, but the iMac was so thin that you can see the difference here. Of course, that size difference is to pack in the ventilation and speakers, which you can see precisely carved into the top and the bottom of the monitor. So now you're caught up on the design of this monitor. Hopefully you can understand at least some of the appeal. But when you're buying something, you usually compare a couple similar products together. So on paper, the Studio Display comes at 27 inches, 1520 by 2880 pixels, P3 color range, 600 nits of brightness, built-in webcam with center stage, a pass-through Thunderbolt cable, and comes at a price of $15.99. Now, the obvious comparison I and pretty much everyone else will make is the LG Ultrafine 5K display, released in 2016, and also comes with a 27-inch display, 1520 by 2880 pixels, P3 color range, 500 nits of brightness, a built-in 1080p webcam with microphone, and also that Thunderbolt pass-through cable. Only this one comes at a much lower price of $12.99 US. So this alone caused pure outrage for weeks. People are thinking, who in their right mind pays an additional $300 for an added 100 nits of brightness and an Apple logo stamped on it? I actually stopped using Twitter for a while as I was making this decision to keep or return it because I was exhausted by everybody making this same comparison. And now I'm not saying you're completely wrong. If you just want a good all-in-one monitor with a webcam, some decent speakers, and you don't really care about that additional 100 nits of brightness, then sure, the LG Ultrafine is a better deal. But in all fairness, if that's your only comparison, then really this monitor wasn't designed for you anyway. And then there's the crowd of people who are still outraged that this is a 5K monitor that's outrageously more expensive than their quick Google search of a 4K monitor, and this one's a little bit more complex. If we're just talking about the resolution 4K to 5K, here's what 4K looks like visually represented. And then assuming the same screen size, this is 5K. And then continuing on, this is 6K. So this means that the whole system scales to fit this much more content than it did before with 4K. So this argument between 4K and 5K is actually one of the larger reasons why I would in fact choose 5K and not go back to a cheaper 4K monitor. So obviously people compare screen size and resolution when choosing a monitor, but then factor in the pixel density or pixels per inch because this is actually what's going to lead to the image looking sharper and more vivid. And Mac is designed specifically with a pixel density in mind, and they recommend 110 ppi for non-Retina models and 220 ppi for Retina models. So this means that the optimal screen and resolution combination works out to 4K at 24 inches, 5K at 27 inches, and 6K at 32 inches. Sound familiar? The first two are the exact resolution of the LG ultrafine monitors, and now the Studio display fits in there as well. The third is the exact resolution of the Apple XDR display. The problem is, you have monitors that are great for Retina or great for non-Retina. Then there's some that fall sort of in between those two pixel densities, and those monitors look terrible pretty much no matter what you do. Here's an incredible graphic that compares all the top displays, showing the ones at the top of the range, like Apple's very own XDR display, Studio display, and LG Ultrafine 5K or 24-inch iMac. Then the ones that fall below for non-Retina. The ones in the middle are probably the ones you want to avoid entirely, as they'll end up looking blurry or too smooth instead of that crisp view you actually want from your monitor. So even by that graph, the LG and Studio display are still in the running here, but what about the non-quantifiable parts here? For a second, I want to bring it back to this perception of quality and really the things I really genuinely enjoyed about the Studio display. First up is of course the display. The glossy finish, and like I said, isn't used on most other monitors, creating a really appealing look. And then the glass extends from the display to the bezels, meaning it's all one even plane instead of other monitors that have bezels that pop out from the display. And the bezels on this one are even on all sides with the included camera built in, unlike the LG Ultrafine, which is much thicker on top. And speaking of the camera, it's a 12 megapixel one which is cropping in, so then when you move around it can follow you within the frame, a feature Apple calls center stage. And it's also powered by that A13 processor inside, which is the same as the processor from the iPhone 11. A lot of people are going to complain about the bad quality of the camera, but perception's actually kind of a funny thing, because I found when I enabled both center stage and portrait view to slightly blur the background, most people thought my camera was much more crisp than others I've used in the past. In fact, this was actually brought up in conversations I was having during my testing. So is it great? No. But is it as bad as everybody's saying? Also no. I mean, definitely not a deterrent to buy this thing like it originally seemed like it would be. There's a couple other features I want to call out on this thing, including the Siri integration. You can speak to this thing with Hey Siri, and it can function as if you're talking to a HomePod, but still doesn't give the ability to AirPlay, which is a feature I feel it's kind of lacking. Lastly, something that not a lot of people are talking about is the ability to auto-rotate on this thing. Not a huge benefit if you're using the standard tilt monitor like I am, but if you're using a VESA mount, I think this is a huge benefit that a lot of people will make use of. And by the way, if I knew that it actually did this before I ordered it, I definitely would have gone with that VESA mount, so do your homework. One point that I also need to call out in this review is the compatibility with Windows, or the lack thereof. So this is very much marketed as a Mac display, but maybe you're somebody who wants to use both Mac and Windows. I found in my testing that it can work with Windows, but with some huge limitations. For one, you lose the cool Apple features like Siri integration, spatial audio, and center stage on the webcam, but the most alarming compatibility issue is the brightness problem. So when I hook it up to my Windows computer, it turns on to max brightness, and because the monitor doesn't have any external buttons, you can't turn it down. So you're stuck at that crazy 600 nits of brightness with no way to turn it down. I even tested it to turn the brightness all the way down when connected to a Mac, and then plugged it into Windows, and it ramps it right back up to that max brightness. Apple did release a compatibility update with Windows through Boot Camp, so if you're using Windows through your Mac, it does work, but just plugging in a Windows machine won't be compatible. So while I love this monitor, it's definitely not the right option for Windows users. So I always feel like Apple prices their products at the max range of kind of what you would comprehend based on competitors, and it always just seems slightly out of reach for what they're charging. If you're okay with a plastic monitor that looks good, for sure, go with the LG, but then for an additional $400 to get that aluminum body, all those Apple ecosystem features, something that looks and feels so unapologetically Apple, it's not a good deal, but I understand why people would get it, and also why I would keep it as well. Now, is the Studio display a good deal? No. $2,000 Canadian is an extreme amount of money to pay for a monitor, and it quite literally is the top of the price range that I would be willing to spend. But am I excited to keep it? Hell yeah.